A certain anime out this season shines a light on the dirty side of the Japanese business world, where the concept of work isn't just praised, but put on such a pedestal, the entire workforce should just drop to their knees and prepare to fillet it for the mere chance to engage. It shows the ill side effects plaguing such a disgusting work ethic, while showing the pitfalls of employing the propaganda associated against others in such a way that works as part comedy and part critique of the practice. Not that these companies are going to change, but that it may signal to those under their oppressive regimes to snap out of their stupor and leave it behind, backed by a charismatic character espousing the embrace of an easier work-life mantra. Does it succeed? And why is the corporate structure the cause of so many early deaths in isekai that it's become a trope in need of making fun of? Let's take a closer look at the absurd comedy of Meikyuu Black Company. We're gonna need to get the basic premise out of the way so we're all on the same page here. Meikyuu Black Company is an isekai franchise following a scummy protagonist, whose entire life to that point was exemplified by the smart capitalist mindset, working the stock market to build a small fortune, and then investing it into real estate overseas, all to amass passive income allowed him to live an uber neat lifestyle. And this was all his master plan so he wouldn't have to get a real job. Too bad he got abducted into a fantasy world shortly after achieving his dream, where he's now saddled with a mountain of debt and has to work in a shitty mining company to pay it back. This is the sort of company that treats its labor more like slaves than employees, using every trick it can to get said employees to repatriate their wages back to the company through the company store or through company goods. This concept is drilled into the audience early on by the head of the corporation asking the employees if they're working like their lives depended on it. These people are crammed into dangerous dungeons and mining until they either drop dead from exhaustion or go insane from overwork. And that seems outright cartoonish, right? That these people would risk their lives for a meager wage, or work until their sanity cracks in two. That's an obvious exaggeration that couldn't possibly happen in real life. Or at least you would hope. And hey, if you look, you're currently watching a YouTube video on it. So I'm sure you've probably figured out the answer to that question. So let me introduce you to the horrors of black companies. Black company is a phrase coined in the early 2000s by young IT workers, who found themselves dealing with an excess of 80 hours of overtime a month. It's working roughly 60 hours a week, or 12 hours a day for your average work week. Some reported even working over 100 hours overtime in a single month. The only somewhat redeeming factor for this absurd level of overtime would be the sweet paycheck these workers would get, if this was compensated overtime, which it wasn't. Yeah, unfortunately in Japan there's a thing called service overtime, where you're not paid and you just work extra hours for the hell of it. These companies exploited staff in their 20s and 30s who didn't have families of their own to worry about, pushing this need for them to work longer hours. This is compounded by the fact that these jobs often offered no overtime pay, little or no benefits, low number of and number used of paid leave days, as well as a hostile environment with power harassment, sexual harassment, and moral harassment from colleagues and management alike. This adds up to a company that treats its overworked employees poorly under the pretense that they're disposable. It's this sort of mentality that culminated in 2008 when a 26-year-old worker killed herself just after 2 months of joining the izakaya restaurant chain. She regularly worked 14-hour days, worked excessive overtime on the weekends, and found herself called in early for morning meetings, even on holidays. It was discovered that her monthly overtime exceeded 140 hours. After an independent examination, it was ruled work-related stress caused her mental health problems that directly led to her death. This is something we see in the anime. Not death per se, but this severe level of overwork. If they're not making money in one department, ship them to another, where they might die on the job and end their useless existence not making the company more money. Even the top earners who are hopelessly invested are a mere means to an end. If the working conditions suck that bad, with the ungodly amount of unpaid overtime, constant harassment, and little job satisfaction, why would people stick around? Well, it comes down to propaganda and how the employment structure is in Japan. Brainwashing by these sort of corporations begins early on, even from the outset of the recruitment phase. Typically, these processes are short, and a red flag is certain language used. Empty-sounding promises about customers' happy faces or chances for growth or, verbatim, something worth living for, are all indications that a company isn't being forthright. Incredibly low or even high pay is an even more clear red flag, especially if the phrase fixed overtime appears in the contract. Part of a checklist used to identify these sort of companies, which employees are able to fill out themselves and submit to a separate independent review board for naming the shittiest companies each year, even has their training sessions which use what can be considered brainwashing or hazing, and I can't quit the job. If I say I'm going to quit, I'll be threatened that I'll have to pay damages for quitting as criteria. Companies even put slogans on the wall like "work until you die" as a sort of constant reminder. Indoctrination is key. People won't stick around in such an environment unless conditioned to do so, and using similar tactics that are found in abusive relationships proves effective. Possessiveness? Like controlling the time in which people leave work or forcing them to stay there for excessive overtime, insults to destroy an employee's self-worth, threats of violence like their managers and coworkers telling them that they'll kill them. And we see all this in the show itself. The characters are literally taken to a training camp where they're run ragged, fed a diet of propaganda, while also devaluing their ego so they're more easily broken. The goal of which is to make them into ideal employees, who are going to give their all for the company's profit. In essence, it's a sort of cult mentality applied to a capitalist structure, with no moral or ethical qualms about wringing out as much from its resources as possible. And that includes its human resources. This is played as a comedy, but deep down, with how the protagonist doesn't buy it, it demonstrates that people need to recognize what poor investment a company is, and get out while they still can. And hey, fucking over the system on the way out is just icing on the cake. Meikyuu Black Company really analyzes the current Japanese trend of almost literally devouring employees for the sake of corporate greed. It holds that up and says, "This is shit. You can do better. Pay attention to these signs, recognize how they're manipulating you, and don't believe their bullshit." It's for that reason, it stands out as a nice commentary where the normal working for a bad company before an isekai plot kicks off as just an excuse to get the protagonist into that world is turned into a message about working, where exploitation is more common than you think. So keep an eye out, think smarter, don't work harder, and keep yourself sane. Which is why it's probably the anime more people should watch before stepping out into the workforce. Hey, you made it to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and do all the other YouTube stuff to help the channel grow. You can also join my Discord with a link down in the description. And if you really want to support me, you can head on over to my Patreon and pick up some extra perks, like voting on what I do next. Thanks for watching.